Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm Todd Rhodes, and I'm joined here today with William Vanderbloemen from Vanderbloemen Search Group. And we're going to talk about William and Warren Bird's brand new book. It's called Next, Pastoral Succession That Works. Thanks for joining me today, William.
Thanks, Todd. Really appreciate you having me.
Hey, when we first set up this interview, you were telling me a little bit about the book, and something I thought was really interesting and that gives a lot of credence to what this book has to say is you said that you actually had over 200 face-to-face interviews with pastors talking about this whole area of pastoral succession. And you promise in your book, and I've read it, you share the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're just going to ask some questions here and kind of give some people some ideas overall on succession and why they need to pick up the book, because it's a great book. Every pastor should really pick up this book. My first question is, let's just start right with the nitty gritty. With all the interviews that you did, how many, just give me your gut feel, how much of a difference did it make for the churches that actually had a plan? A lot of churches go through successions really without a plan. It happened at Thomas Road Baptist when Jerry Falwell died. There's other churches that kind of stumble into it, but how big of a difference did you find in your research did having an actual plan make?
That's an easy question to answer because there aren't many churches that have a plan. And I don't know that there are enough of them to have a sampling that would give a statistical good or bad. But one statistic that came up in the book, I'll get the percentages wrong, but something like in corporate America now, when a new CEO is hired, something north of 70% of those new CEOs are internal hires. And the church is nowhere near that with senior pastors. Somebody asked me about this recently. So, well, what's the percentage in churches? I said, well, it's next to nothing because we haven't been doing succession planning. Give the church 20 or 30 years of focusing on this conversation, and we'll be building pipelines, and we'll have a better idea of where people come from. And then I think you'll see something like 3 out of 4 churches knew exactly what was going to happen when the pastor retired, and it went smoothly. And right now, it's not anywhere close to that.
Sure. Well, and that brings up a good point. And I'm going to ask you this question. I think the answer is probably pretty obvious. But why all this talk of succession now? I mean, here the last couple of years, it's really kind of a buzzword in the whole church leadership and staffing world is succession and succession planning. 5 years ago, you really didn't hear that much about succession. So why now?
I could agree with you more. When Warren and I first talked about it, we loved studying churches, so we'll write a book about it even if it wouldn't sell. And I knew my mother would buy 5 copies, so we're all good. But we really wondered, would a publisher be interested in this? And in the end, we had to decide which publisher we wanted to go with because we had multiples that were after us. So something has shifted. And then as we wrote the book, it felt like every time we went somewhere, somebody was talking about succession. And maybe that's just, I got a hammer so everything looks like a nail. But I really think the conversation has gone to a much more robust place. And in thinking about it, there are a couple of dynamics at work, one on the pastor side and one on the church board side. I think on the church board first, 25 years ago, succession planning was not something you heard much about in corporate America. Mm-hmm. Now it's almost standard procedure. It's almost the first and chief function of the board, particularly in publicly traded companies. And church boards are made up of people who are business leaders oftentimes, and usually well-seasoned business leaders, not just brand new green people. So I think the church board in America now is filled with some people who have had a normalization of the conversation around succession at work. They've seen this happen over 20, 25 years. And it's like, oh, why haven't we been doing this? And if you look at trends in how churches think corporately, it's a 20, 25-year lag, whether it's strategic planning. We started about 20, 25 years after the business. So it's kind of the right time. On the church side, the pastor side, going on 40 years, 1975, Bill Hybels plants Willow Creek Church. 5 years later, 1980, Rick Warren plants Saddleback Church. And with them came a whole wave of entrepreneurial pastors that thought about target audiences and strategic planning and kind of a redeemed corporate focus for the church so that we could focus on church growth. That slew of pastors is now round about 60 years old.
Yep.
They've pioneered everything. They pioneered drums in church, they pioneered everything. It's only natural to me that as they're facing their autumn years, they're going to pioneer a new conversation about succession. So I think those two things have come together. There are probably a lot of other things. And my mother buying a bunch of the books helps.
That always helps, doesn't it? Yeah, that tracks right on with what kind of what I've seen, with my work with Leadership Network. 5 years ago, when we would mention, have conversations with leaders about the topic of succession, everybody wanted to talk about it in a small group, one-on-one. They wanted, here's the caveat, they wanted to talk about everybody else's succession and not their own.
Exactly.
Where I think the last couple of years, the reality has maybe set in a little bit for some of the guys you're talking about. They're getting to the age where they know that in order for them to have a lasting legacy, I believe you say it in your book, there's no success without succession. In order for some of these lead pastors of some of the really large churches, and small churches for that matter too, in a small community, you really do have to kind of embrace that, because if you leave and the church goes south, that's 25, 30, 40 years of work that really seems to go down the drain, at least in a lot of these guys' minds, right?
Yeah, totally. And maybe more than that, after a bad succession, the church is in a negative position, not just where they were before the guy left. It's backwards, and digging out of the hole is hard.
Yeah.
Warren and I wrote the book for a number of reasons, but one of the big reasons for me, and I believe for him as well, was just to have something that would legitimize the conversation. It's not like we've got the secret blueprint or the 8 steps to find. It's not a cookie cutter book. Mm-hmm. It's more, here are the trends, here's what we're seeing. And by the way, it's okay to talk about this. In fact, it might be your biggest responsibility as a pastor and a board.
Mm-hmm. Great segue into my next question. So what recommendations should you give to a church or to a pastor that needs to start this conversation? I understand that a lot of pastors are, they're a little scared, quite honestly, to bring up even the idea that, maybe 5 years from now or 10 years from now, I see myself, transitioning. Because quite frankly, a lot of churches in the past have handled staff members that as soon as you give any intent whatsoever at any point in the future that you're going to transition, that timeline automatically is out of your hands and gets moved up much quicker than what you want it to be.
Yep.
2 questions. First of all, how do you start the conversation? And second of all, maybe you can delve into this a little bit. Does it make a difference who starts the conversation as far as whether or not the succession is successful? Do you see more successful successions happen when it's the senior pastor's idea or when it's the board's idea? Does that have any factor?
Sure. Let's go backwards. I'll start with that second question.
Sorry, I've got a lot of questions.
Yeah. Bob Russell, who, really well-known pastor at Southeast Christian in Louisville, had a fantastic transition with Dave Stone. They wrote a little case study of it. It's a great book. It won't take long to read. It's called Transition Plan. It doesn't have the data and hundreds of case studies that are. It's just a different kind of book, but well worth the read. He says in that book something like, if the pastor brings up the conversation, it's a transition plan. If the board brings up the conversation, it's a termination plan.
Yeah.
I don't know that has to be true. I do know this. One of the cardinal rules of succession is it's all going to rise and fall on the outgoing pastor's shoulders. It cannot go optimally if the pastor that's leaving is not committed to leaving and leaving well. If they dig in, if part of their family digs in, it's just not going to work. So I think better that the audience that we were shooting for with this book was the senior pastor, and doesn't matter the age, with a board member looking over his shoulder, reading over his shoulder. So, I think it probably right now is better that pastors start the conversation. And one sentence sort of changed my whole thinking about succession. It's how we start the book. Every pastor is an interim pastor. Mm-hmm. And that never occurred to me. I mean, we help churches find their key staff at our search firm, and we literally get hundreds and hundreds of new contacts in every week, and we'll go through those and talk to candidates, and you talk about what do you want to be when you grow up, sort of conversations, and they'll say, I want to be a teaching pastor, I want to be a student pastor, I want to be a children's pastor, a senior pastor. Very rarely do you hear them say, I want to be an interim pastor. It's not the most desired. Some people do it and are committed to it, but the realization and that sentence can be your conversation starter with your board. Here's the deal, guys. There are 3 possible outcomes here. 1, I run the church into the ground and we have to close. 2, Jesus returns. That would be cool, but I think he told us not to kind of bank on that for this particular moment. Or 3, somebody's coming after me. And better for us to talk about it now. I think the church, by and large, has viewed the relationship between pastor and church. It's not just a job, and it's true, it's not just a job, but they almost view it like a marriage.
Yeah.
And if the minute you start talking about dating around or who you're going to be married to after me, it gets weird. And I think the proper theological framework is the church is married to Christ, not the pastor. So the pastor's just here for the season. So I think framing it theologically and realistically, the pastor's got some real chips there. And honestly, I think the best time to do it is your very first board meeting as pastor. Talk about it from the beginning. And that's what we saw. We studied quite a bit of corporate training on succession planning, and the best companies we saw were ones where the normal thing for a new CEO is to start the first board meeting with, what will we do when I leave? Where should we be? How should we develop candidates? And beyond that, I think that we will come to a time where it's just part of the board's expectation that that's a first conversation. I think we're years from that, but I think we have a chance of it becoming a normal thing. I mean, it was a normal thing in the United Methodist Church forever. You're going to be here 4 years. We're going to have moving day. It's not impossible. It's just, I think we've gotten a little bit out of whack on how we view our pastors as opposed to the Savior.
Yeah. Good ideas there. Want to switch? We got just a couple minutes left. One more question for you. We're going to totally switch gears here, and then I've got a couple fast fire questions for you, just real quick. You and Warren have a whole chapter in your book about money, and normally when you're talking about succession, money's not something that normally comes up, but you say it's a really important part to consider in any succession plan. Tell me what you're thinking.
Well, what I'm thinking is we looked at succession plans that haven't worked and succession plans that never got set in motion. And you say, well, why is that? And there are 2 big reasons. There are actually 3, but 2 in the book. One is the pastor can't afford to retire. Yeah. And, the book is not written about retirement as much as transitions. But when you're talking about retirement, pastors get asked to live in and among their congregation and socialize among them. But most of the time, they don't make as much money as the congregation does. And so they're kind of spending all they have just to keep up with the lifestyle they've been asked to live. And by the way, no one teaches pastors how to financially plan. So we offer some guidelines in the book to say, let's make sure that it's an option. And John Maxwell told me years ago when I was a young pastor, and I said, what should I be focused on in these young years? He said, smart young pastors spend their early years creating options for their later years. And I think that's true with finances. So if you're a 30-year-old pastor, start thinking about it. Pastors don't even realize that when they leave, their housing allowance goes away. When they leave, the people taking you to lunch twice a week or whatever the thing is, all the little benefits. So we've tried to create an exhaustive list, say, what do you really need to get by? And then offer some advice to boards about paying for financial planning for pastors. It doesn't have to be a board member getting in the pastor's business. We'll give you however many $1,000s it is every so many years to go spend it on financial planning. We really think if you take that piece of the puzzle and neutralize it, then you're going to find that you're much more free to have a conversation about succession.
Yeah, and I would just encourage churches to do that early too. And I think that, don't you think, William, that's going to be something that churches do better in the future?
Absolutely.
just because out of necessity. Because I agree, you can't have that discussion about transition and succession when the pastor's not taken care of financially.
Well, and it's not
They've got concerns and worries themselves.
it's not like the church has been messing this up forever. You know, up until the 80s and 90s, most pastors were in some kind of denominational structure that had a pension plan.
Yep.
They really didn't have to worry about it. And now that non-denominational churches outnumber denominational churches in terms of populace, it's a different day. And some people have a plan and some people don't. I think the church has to just drop back and say, we're going to have to rethink this whole thing and do it early.
Yeah, you have to be generous early or else you'll have to be really generous later, right?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, great. Fast fire questions. I got about 2 minutes here. So just quick answers to these. You mentioned this internal versus external hires. What did you say the percentages you found as far as internal hires for succession right now? It's pretty low.
Oh, that's in corporate America. I don't have a statistic. Yeah.
What, gut feel. Fast fire. What do you think percentages internal bringing somebody up that's already on your staff?
Depends on the denomination.
Really?
You see a lot of father-son hands-off or handoffs in a spirit-filled background, but not so much in the main line. So it really just depends, but not enough. Not enough. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Current senior pastor have a say?
Either an entire say or no say, but nowhere in between.
Nowhere in between. There's models are all over the place. Any better idea you have? I mean, do you see better successions happening with pastors that say, this is my guy, or pastors that say, nope, that's your guys' decision, I'm out of here?
That's easy. There is no right answer. It's highly contextual. I wish I could automate it and do an eHarmony for succession and be done with it, but it's just very different.
It's not going to happen. You mentioned this earlier. Is it possible to have a healthy, or have you ever seen, let me put it this way, have you ever seen a healthy succession or transition in which the current lead pastor or senior pastor isn't fully on board?
I've seen it work, but not work as well as it could if the pastor were on board.
Percentage of pastors, again, just off the hip, percentage of pastors that when they announce a succession date, they stick around compared to those that kind of, just go off and don't serve in the church anymore. Does that make sense?
50-50.
50-50? Does it work?
Yes, it's a guess.
According to the model?
Yeah, it can go well or poorly. It depends on the situation. If it's a small town where all the relatives are around and you're going to be looming over but if you're in a major metro area, it can work. It really depends. But I'd say right now I'm seeing about 50-50.
And I would assume a lot of that has to do with the relationship that's between the successor and the successee, right?
Totally.
If that relationship is good, chances are that succession will go much, much better.
And you still have some denominations that actually have mandated rules about these things, and that skews the percentages some.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, William. Tell us a little bit more. You're, of course, Vanderbloemen Search Group. We staff the church.com, but tell people how you can, how they can get a copy of the book.
You can go to nextpastor.com, and there you'll find every outlet in the world for whether it's Barnes & Noble or Amazon or anything you want. I'd give you my mother's phone number, but because she has extra copies.
Extra copies, sure.
She might make you a deal, but other than that, just go to nextpastor.com.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Good luck with the book, and it's a great conversation that the church really needs to be having. And I think this book's really going to help a lot of pastors and a lot of church boards have that conversation. So thanks for writing it.
Appreciate you making time for it, man. Thanks for all you do.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.